Indeed, if JFK hadn't been assassinated, if his policies had prevailed, what America do you think we would have today?
A whole different world, a whole different world. I think his brother was also a progressive. He would have followed. There would have been probably, hopefully 16 years of Kennedy's, and who knows, Teddy Kennedy was another factor. Certainly they knew this. You know, Roosevelt, he really had a significant effect on the American psyche as well as the economy, and made a huge difference in World War II. But Kennedy would have had a similar hold on the American public, and I think we would be less conservative, less violent. I think war breeds more violence and callousness in society. Kennedy was a man, as he says in the film, a man of peace, because he'd been in war. He'd been a decorated combat veteran. He knew what the meaning of it was. He said himself, you know, you can't follow the generals. You can't believe these generals. You know, he was that kind of man who called the shots as they saw them. He saw it coming. And he says that we do not need a world of Pax Americana, American peace, supported by weapons of war, which is where we're at now. We're into a world that's highly rigid and stigmatized by the difference between various enemies that we call them enemies: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Europe, you're from Europe. Europe is in a sense, a captive satellite of the United States. You're under our nuclear umbrella. I don't think any of this would have happened if the Kennedy ethos had succeeded.
Yeah, that was that's actually ridiculous.
Yeah. All right. So that's where I wanted to start this conversation. I guess JG Michael from Parallax View is here. I guess Gene hasn't let him in yet. But so the first topic I wanted to talk about with this is like the limits of liberal conspiracy theories, because, you know, as much as Oliver Stone has kind of been derided for as long as he has, he's basically just a liberal, right? Like when it really comes down to it, like he's kind of disillusioned. He kind of has what I call new atheist brain, in the sense of like, you know, he's gone so far into the he's fully invested in the like US is evil, other places like Russia and China are good, which, you know, everything is complicated and nuanced, I'd say. And the limits of where his imagination can go is Kennedy as president would completely change the status quo for whatever reason. And I think people like Jim Garrison, who wrote the On the Trail of the Assassins that this is based on, kind of suffers from the same thing. As much as they want to make the point that the US is bad, they don't touch on imperialism necessarily. They don't touch on completely changing our economic system that, you know, really creates this military industrial complex. It's just, well, you know, if Kennedy had survived, we'd be saved.
I think these guys are fundamentally radical liberals, in that they are liberal, but they're of a variety in which they at least want to critique some of the veneers of how the institutions work. I definitely don't think that they are interested in displacing capitalism per se. Even if they do, I think they're more kind of fetishizing a kind of Keynesian FDR reboot. And I also believe that as much fracas as they would make in terms of criticizing the way America operates geostrategically in the world, what fundamentally makes them liberal in my mind is that I think that Stone, as well as his ilk, and I think a lot of that is generational as well, right? They fundamentally believe America is not only potentially a force of good in the world, but that America has it's the job of America to be a force of good in the world. And the problem that America has is that it's derelicting its duty as being a force of good in the world. And I think that their actual analysis suffers from a fundamental unwillingness to accept what Gore Vidal accepted many times, and he talked about clearly before he died, is that America is an empire. All right, and empires are not designed to be forces of good in the world. Empires exist for promoting their own existence and accumulation of wealth, power, capital, and geostrategic sovereignty over the dominions and control of various international perspectives on the planet. And I think that the fundamental problem that he has is that he's unable to reconcile that's what America really is. I'm actually very interested to hear what our friend Kuba thinks about this.
Well, I agree with you largely, and I think that with Oliver Stone and um, many sort of artists, thinkers, writers of his generation, there's they were raised when the traditional national myths of the United States were still had very powerful currency, and the way that criticism was couched was always, well, maybe this is what America is doing now, or people are doing this in the name of America, but that's not really what America's about. And that these are departures, derelictions of the liberal duty of the United States to be a force for good in the world. And I think that that moralism is a big part of the problem. And it makes Oliver Stone treat this Kennedy assassination as a kind of Christian fall from grace, that the United States was in a condition of innocence, or at least in an optimistic, upright, trying its best, having a goodwill. Maybe things don't always work out, but we still beat the Nazis. We're still the good guys, and you could have faith in the institutions and the elite leadership class to do its best, morally speaking. And then you have this, the serpent in the form of the military-industrial complex enters Camelot, if I can mix metaphors, and King Arthur gets clipped, and all of a sudden you have this extraordinarily unsavory reality, a kind of hostile takeover of the apparatus of governance, and creatures like Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush, who has a long history with the CIA and other parts of the
literally the CIA director for a couple of years.
Exactly. And the CIA director at the moment where the CIA was most vulnerable as well. So I think that drive to moralize American history, to insist that the roots of the United States are exceptional, and that there was a mission that the United States was on to introduce democracy and a better way of doing things in the world. It's very difficult for Americans who were brought up at the center, especially white middle class Americans that have been exposed to this their whole lives, especially in that mid-century period when you could make a plausible case to that group that everything was going fine. Just trust the government. We beat Hitler. We're standing up to the evil commies. There's the Great Society. There's civil rights. Things are improving. The system works. And when reality strikes and you see the operation of power in a naked form, like with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the prosecution of the Vietnam War, other major political and international developments of that era.
The assassination of RFK
Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's a shock that comes with that. And I think that the most, Pascal has one take, which is that, empires do what empires do. They don't exist to serve a moral purpose. They exist to accumulate power. I'd go further and say that, that's the basis of statecraft. That is in international competition, when you have states that are existential threats to one another, where there's the possibility of, ending the entire elite of a country, or maybe the entire country itself, through outside violence. you have very ruthless types of policy that are enacted, and the you can try to get away from that. I'm not saying that it's inevitable to have the CIA going around assassinating everybody that gets in their way, but that is the condition that that prevails unless you're going to do something about it.
I mean, this absolute absurdity that we hear Stone talking about is like, oh, JFK was a man of peace, and if he had lived, I was like, didn't JFK create the Peace Corps to basically be a subversive force throughout the third world, developing world, in order to basically spy on people covertly in order to make sure they didn't become communists? I mean, what are you talking about?
But that's the thing, right? Like, if you're an anti-communist American liberal, you're describing the most noble thing you can do. Similarly, if you're an ultra-Catholic, then the Jesuits aren't fanatical religious fundamentalists bent on subverting every other spiritual order on earth and enslaving everyone to the Pope. They're the soldiers of Christ doing God's work on earth. So if you belong to that American moral universe, if that's the way that you view the world, then the Peace Corps is something beautiful. It's only when you're on the other side of the equation and you apply a different framework to it that it starts looking like the way you described.
JG, did you have a chance to see the clip that we're talking about in the beginning?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I think Oliver Stone's a very interesting person because I think his views on some things have changed since JFK. I know that since he's worked with Peter Kuznick on the Untold History of the United States, that he seems to think the national security state and its malfeasances go back long before Kennedy, even going back to World War II with the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think what's interesting for me about Stone is you can tell movies like this are very personal to him, because I feel like what drives Stone in a lot of his films like JFK is the feeling that he was lied to about Vietnam. And of course he served in Vietnam. So I think that plays a really huge role in this film. You can tell that he's very invested in this idea that we were lied to. And I do think that it's true. There's aspects of the film that I find off-putting, like when we have the Donald Sutherland character, Mr. X, who I believe is based on L. Fletcher Prouty, talking about...
No, it's Stone basically in conversation, I believe, with L. Fletcher Prouty. Which makes it kind of a jarring moment, because it's Stone inserting himself into the Jim Garrison character for that scene.
Well, it's interesting because when Prouty's talking, he mentions Operation Ajax, the whole overthrow of Mossadegh that happened on the CIA's watch, and I'm like, well, it doesn't sound like we were too good before Kennedy got shot. So I feel like it's a very weird film in that regard, because there's hints given that the problems of the national security state apparatus have existed with us far longer than Kennedy's death, and yet he seems to just focus on Kennedy's death as the starting point.
Well, I think that a lot of leftists fall into a similar thing with the Sanders campaign in both 2016 and in 2020, where there's this belief that it was an exit ramp. It's our last exit ramp. Like, electing Bernie Sanders somehow would have been our last exit ramp. After like climate crisis, inequality, all of these things. And in a similar way, I think for people of Stone's generation, they feel like JFK would have been their one exit ramp. And I don't think it bears out, because I think that JFK would have automatically folded very quickly to the security, like the intelligence, security, and military establishment, and probably continued his invasion of Vietnam. I think it's really, I think it's really naive to think that when he said that he wanted to stop our invasion of Vietnam, like we'll stop bringing troops into Vietnam on the ground, that he would have somehow pushed against that in some brilliant way that no one else could possibly do.
It's tricky, because there are personal powers that belong to the United States president, and they're an individual can make a difference. It's not just the grinding of the bureaucratic gears between different segments of, the military, the civil bureaucracy, congressional interests, large corporations. For instance, Joe Biden got out of Afghanistan. If it were not for him, if the bureaucratic gears kept grinding, then that exit would have never happened. There were all of the institutional interests in Washington were lined up for permanent occupation. So, who knows what Kennedy would have done? But I agree that there's this blindness to the power of those institutions, and to the fact that they've always been there. They predate Kennedy. Maybe in the Red Scare launched by Woodrow Wilson, tapped a lot of the kind of domestic powers that would later be used by the FBI. If you go back far enough, then you get to a point where there just wasn't enough technological sophistication, enough population density to have a security apparatus along modern lines. But that's how far back you have to go to avoid the issue of creating these powerful bureaucries.
But you still see that on a corporate level, right? Like the Pinkertons, like forces like that kind of create a maybe a private but still a national like a national intelligence apparatus that operates between a lot of large corporations, like even in the late 1800s,
I think you'd probably have to go back to, and that's the thing, there's at the start of the United States, you have repression, surveillance, the security apparatus, but on the level of plantations and operating at the level of families and localities. And in a lot of ways, the disputes between the different colonies at the beginning of American history were questions of whether or not that power would stay in private hands, or at best in the hands of the state, or whether it would go up to the national level. And it's just less efficient if you handle it locally. But if you handle it locally, the people who that power devolves to, meaning like local oligarchs, plantation owners, machine politicians, are very happy because they don't answer to anybody.
Yeah. In a similar way that nationally, the CIA seems to not have answered to anybody for, until the Church Committee, really. Like, as much as Kennedy fired Allen Dulles and fired kind of the upper echelon of the CIA, they were still very much operating as private contractors, pretty much, like behind the scenes.